The next two neurotransmitters in tandem, and then we'll talk about them one at a time. Glutamate is a primary excitatory neurotransmitter, and GABA is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, as many things, balance is key. In a situation where you have too much glutamate, that can lead to seizures, excitotoxicity, and brain death. In situations with too much GABA, that can lead to unresponsiveness, coma, and death. Okay, glutamate. Glutamate works via two receptors, the NMDA and the AMPA. Now, AMPA receptors are fairly straightforward. In a nice linear fashion, as you increase glutamate, you increase the activation of AMPAs. But the NMDA receptor is different. It doesn't activate until you have a high level of stimulation. So they will not react unless strongly stimulated. Now, let's turn our attention to something that seems unrelated but is absolutely related. Learning at the cellular level has been investigated for many decades. In fact, the search for understanding learning was key to the origin of psychology and to the origin of neuroscience. The idea is that, presumably in the monistic view, if you learn something, there should be a physical change in the body related to that learning. And being neuroscientists, we understand that that change really must be in the brain. So neuroscientists have been searching for evidence of learning in the brain. And looks like it's been found. At least one of the major mechanisms. There may be more, but this is part of the picture. Let's start with long-term potentiation. What this refers to is the strengthening of synaptic connections. Because I think it's simple enough to understand that not all synaptic connections are going to be equally weighted. If we made a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 was very weak connection and 10 was very strong, some of these, let's start naming these neurons. Some of these connections will be strong. Some will be weak. And of course, everything in between. The hypothesis is that memories are in some way, which is still a mystery, but in some way encoded in changing synaptic weights throughout a distributed network, presumably in the hippocampus at first and then in the cortex, but uncertain. But it's simple enough to understand that there are different strengths of connections between different neurons. So the question is, how do we change the strength of these connections? Well, here we rely on a old neuroscientist, Hebb's law, which basically states, sorry for the rhyme, neurons that fire together wire together. Now, maintaining strong synapses is more work for your body than maintaining weak ones. So, as with the muscles of your body will maintain the synaptic weights that seem to be required, meaning the ones you're using. So, this is experience dependent cellular change. The old use it or lose it. Coactivation leads to strengthening of synaptic strength. Let's look at how that works. Let's draw a synapse. This is, of course, the pre, this is the post. In order to get this synapse to grow stronger, we talked about how we need strong activity of this synapse, activity dependent learning. So, how do you get this strong activity? Well, I can tell you experimentally, we use a tetanus, which is a rapid and or strong electrical stimulation. But I don't think you care so much about experimentally. I think what matters to us, especially as psychologists, is in real life, how do you do this? And here's where I have to use words like presumably and based on what we see in the lab, caveats, because the science isn't there yet. But I do feel fairly confident that it's going to be exactly what you think it is, which is study. Use it. If you want a synapse to strengthen, you have to use it. There are no shortcuts. All right, so let's get back to how does this work? Well, let me draw some AMPA and some NMDA receptors. This is glutamate. These are sodium ions. Draw one more calcium ion. Okay. So what happens is this. The action potential comes, causes release of glutamate, and some of those glutamate molecules find their way to an AMPA receptor. Now, if we switch to yellow, if we open up one AMPA receptor, that will allow, just imagine this is a schematic, not literally, that'll allow one sodium ion to come in, depolarizing the cell. Okay, but what if a lot of glutamate gets released? And maybe you have a lot of activation of AMPAs and a lot of sodium comes in. Then, and only then, do your NMDA channels open. So the channel controlled by the NMDA receptor actually is a calcium channel. So calcium enters via these NMDA receptors. Now the entry of calcium into the postsynaptic cell causes protein synthesis. Specifically, it causes production of new AMPA receptors. Now these new AMPA receptors get produced and get inserted into the membrane. And I'm going to draw these new ones as smaller just to differentiate them. So now we've added new AMPA receptors. Does it feel intuitive why inserting new AMPA receptors effectively strengthen this synapse? A silly way, but it works for me to think of it, is imagine you doubled the number of ears you had. See, this key change that happens is not presynaptic. You're not releasing more neurotransmitter. In my silly analogy, that would be like me yelling. No, rather, the strengthening comes from improvement in the listening side, on the postsynaptic side. So that given the same signal output, now you have significantly greater sensitivity. You have thus strengthened that synapse. And this is a process known as LTP. Now, do you think your brain will maintain this strengthened synapse if you don't use it? No, it won't, because that wouldn't make any sense. That would be like maintaining muscle mass if you stop exercising. So that is how we strengthen synapses. But if all we had were mechanisms to strengthen synapses, you would end up with an overwhelmed network. So there is indeed a counter mechanism, and that is called LTD. Now, LTD is a weakening of synaptic strength, where those NMDA receptors are reabsorbed back into the neuron, thereby weakening the synaptic strength. Now, how do you get this? Experimentally, persistently weak stimulation. Phenomenologically, what I think this translates to is stop using. This breaks my heart, but in higher education, we give you 3 to 5 difficult courses to take, and then we give you a little bit of a break and give you a completely different set of four to five courses. How on earth are you supposed to maintain the gains from this hard work if now you're dashing to learn all this new information? No wonder why a couple weeks after a term, I'd say 90% of what you learned is gone. However, not all is lost, because we think true forgetting doesn't happen. Now, how can we say this? Well, a couple of lines of evidence. One, let's say I have two students, A and B. A took calculus in high school, but says, I forgot. And indeed, I give him a test, fails it. This person never taken calculus. Give him a test, fails it. Put them in a calculus class. Who's going to do better? You know it. Time after time after time, you can demonstrate clearly, even though this person doesn't have conscious recollection of the learning that happened in their calculus course, traces must remain. The other line of evidence is simple memory testing. If I give you a list of 30 words and come back in 2 days, tell me how many you remember. I can test you in a number of different ways. Free recall. Then I could have you do cued recall. Then I could have you do multiple choice. And then I could finally have you do a forced choice between two options. So in free recall, you might come up with, let's say, 18 of them. Then you tell me, I don't know anymore, I'm done. I say, oh yeah? How about this? How about a clue? There were 6 fruits on the list. You're liable to say, aha, I remember 2 more. I say, okay, very good. And you'll say, but I remember no more. That could give you a multiple choice test. I could say, one of these was definitely on the list. Which one? And you will be way better than chance. But you say, I remember no more. Then I'll say, okay, all right. One of these 2 words was on the list. Which one? And you will be significantly better than chance. showing each time the person's subjective experience is, I'm tapped out, I don't remember anymore. But you can see through different kinds of probing, there are hints. And this, I won't belabor this here, but it's fun to think about. Uh, it's intriguing to consider that none of our experiences go uh, without a trace. Goes back to that pool ball discussion we had. The trace doesn't have to be major every time, but nonetheless, everything leaves a trace.